Hey, I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain. Today I'm going to be showing you how to change out the fork seals on your Sachs 48mm open chamber forks that come on beta dirt bikes. These forks came off our 2020 Beta 200RR. We had some leaky fork seals, and if that happens on your bike, you want to get those taken care of as soon as you can. That way your forks are going to work correctly and you're not going to get oil all over your brake rotor, because that can affect your stopping performance. So be aware of that, get those taken care of. Now, another thing to be aware of is with these betas, there's several different forks that can come on your bike, and you need to know which forks you have. So depending on what bike you have, you could either have KYB, Marzocchi, the Sachs, or the cross trainers actually have Olay forks on them. So, you know, all these forks, even within those brands, you can either have an open or a closed cartridge fork or dual chamber fork. Now our forks have the open cartridge, and the process will be similar for any of the 2012 and newer bikes that have the Sachs 48mm open cartridge forks on them. Now, to verify that you have the same forks as us, you want to refer to the specs for your bike, look those up. But if you can't find those or you're still not sure, you can look at your fork caps and make sure they look like ours. So we have the separate function forks. So this is going to be the 2019 and newer models. So on our right fork, we have the compression adjuster as well as our preload adjuster. And then the left fork does all the rebound. Now on the 2012 to 2018 open cartridge forks, they're going to have compression and rebound adjusters on both forks, and the caps are going to look the same. But no matter what bike you're working on, make sure you reference your model specific service manual. To get this job done, you're going to need a few different things. So we have safety glasses, rubber gloves, some rags, suspension cleaner, a 48mm seal driver. We've got a seal bullet, seal grease, the fork and dust seal kit. This is from Tusk. Some 5-weight fork oil, a drain pan. We've got some maroon Scotch-Brite. You're going to need a few common hand tools, including 19 and 17mm open end wrenches. We've got our ratcheting wrench, our Tusk oil level gauge. We're also going to be using a few different things from Race Tech. So this is the shock clip removal tool. We also have some soft jaws from those guys. So with that being said, let's get started. The first thing you want to do is start out with a clean fork. A lot of times if these seals are leaking, you're going to see a ton of grime down here, and you don't want to get that on the internal parts. So we've gone ahead and cleaned all that stuff off. You can use some suspension cleaner to do that. Now, the other thing we want to do is count our clickers. So on some of the forks, or the ones that aren't the separate function forks, you're going to have a clicker right in the bottom, and then you're going to have one on top as well. But for us, we just have one on top. So we're going to rotate this all the way clockwise and count those clicks until it lightly seats. So we're at 12 clicks. We're going to write that down and then back this all the way out. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and put the fork in your soft jaws. Now just make sure you don't clamp too hard down on this. You don't want to damage it. Then we're going to take the fork cap removal tool. And this is, I believe, a 10-point cap. So you definitely want to have this tool. And we'll go ahead and break this loose. If this doesn't come loose easy, you can always, or you don't have soft jaws or whatever, you can always clamp the fork back in your bike. You're probably going to have to remove your handlebars and then break that fork cap loose. And we're going to raise this up, and just inside here, that's where we're going to use our open end wrenches. So for us, we're going to take a thin 19mm open end, and I'm just going to rest that on the end. And then, you know, some of you guys might have a 17mm for the top, but ours is going to be 19 on both. So we're going to break the cap loose. And once it's loose, you can remove that upper wrench and just spin the cap off. And then underneath the cap, you're going to have this collar right there. Just make sure you don't lose that. There's a little metal washer on the bottom. And we're just going to lay out all the parts in order as we disassemble, and that's just going to make reassembly much easier. All right, from here, you can either clamp the axle holder in the soft jaws or grab the bottom of the fork. We're going to raise that up all the way and then remove the wrench. And then that damper rod's just going to fall down. We'll remove our spring, and then we've got our push rod. And we'll pull up on the damper rod. So this spring guide, this black thing, this is plastic, and sometimes these crack. So there's actually a mod that we're going to do to this to help prevent these from cracking. So we're going to go ahead and remove this. If you've already done the mod, you don't need to remove it. So one thing I do want to point out, so we have the O-ring on ours. That's going to be on the 2019 and newer models. The older ones aren't going to have the O-ring. So they say if you do the mod, you don't necessarily have to reinstall this O-ring. Just a heads up. So I'm going to put my hand on the bottom of that fork again so it doesn't just drop down. And then at this point we need to drain out all that oil. So I'm going to remove the fork from the vise, and we're going to drain all that into our oil pan. So I put my finger right over the end. We've got that cone for the spring right there. And then the damper rod, to help this drain out, you can pump this a few times. And one thing, before you let it drain, if you notice the fluid coming out is real dark, you can actually flush this out. So we're going to pour a little bit of oil in there. We'll bleed this up, pump that damper rod a couple times, and then dump it all back out. And then once you have most of that drained out, what we're going to do is set this outer tube back into the soft jaws and just let this drain for 5 or 10 minutes. And just so you guys know, we don't have to completely tear this fork down to get the fork seals replaced. We're going to leave that damper rod in there. So the next step is to clamp the axle holder in the soft jaws. So with that in there, what we're going to do is pop this dust seal out and remove the circlip that's behind it. So I'm just going to use this clip removal tool, or you can use a small flat blade screwdriver, put it in between the seal and that outer fork tube, and just work this dust seal away from the tube. So once that's out of the way, we've got this retaining clip in here. So then we're going to use this clip tool to remove the clip right next to where that gap is. Just be careful not to scratch the tube. So once that's out of the way, you can see there's actually quite a bit of dirt in there. I'm going to spray that out with some suspension clean before we move forward. After you have that cleaned out, we're going to use both fork tubes like a slide hammer, and these are going to come apart. But there's some bushings in here that we don't want to damage. So a tip for you guys is you can use a heat gun and heat this outer tube up right by where those bushings are, or you can also use a torch. But if you use a torch, make sure all that solvent is completely dry. Next, we need to remove our bushings. So to do that, I like to use my thumbnails and just spread the bushing apart. But if you want, you can use a screwdriver or that pick and kind of spread those apart and remove the bushing. Now again, it's really important to lay everything out in order. Once we have everything laid out, we're going to inspect these parts. So we've got this backup ring, our fork seal. It's really important to pay attention to the orientation of how this comes off. We've got the retaining clip, and then the dust seal. Next, we're going to use our suspension clean to clean up some of these parts. Just remember, when it comes to suspension, cleanliness is key. Once you have everything cleaned up, you want to inspect all the parts. So the first thing we're going to inspect is this lower fork tube. Now the main thing you're looking for is any wear or damage in the tube itself. Maybe there's some nicks. If there's really small little rust spots or little nicks, a lot of times you can clean them up with a little bit of this maroon Scotch-Brite. But if it's much bigger than that, or if there's serious damage to this, you definitely want to get it replaced. Now, if you're not sure if you need to clean something up, you can always run your fingernail over any spots you see, and if your fingernail catches, you know you need to clean that up. Next, we're going to inspect the bushings. Now, what you're looking for, this is a Teflon coating, and if you see any copper material underneath that Teflon coating, then you need to replace these, but ours are looking good. So this is the one for that inner fork tube. So the coating is going to be on the outside. The other one, you're looking on the inside, and you'll do the same inspection. So that Teflon is looking good. And then everything else, you're just going to look for obvious signs of damage. You know, this outer tube, you're going to look for any dings. Maybe the bike was laid down and a rock hit it. If there's a big ding in this, then you're going to want to get it replaced. Now before we go back together, we're going to do that spring guide mod. So on these 2019 models, you're going to have a little dot on each side, and we're going to drill that out to 3 millimeters. On the 2012 to 2018 models, you're not going to have that. If you go down to the end of these splines, you're going to have one hole here. You can just punch that, and then 180 degrees, you'll do another hole. And then ours kind of left a lip right there. I am going to use a razor blade to clean that up. And then the last thing with this mod, we want to make sure everything's cleaned out really well. So there's some little pieces that were still attached inside. So I'm just using a drill bit by hand, kind of running it over those ends just to smooth it out. If you had a little round file or something like that, that would work fine too. And then we're just going to spray it off. From here, we're ready to assemble. So I'm going to put the seal bullet on. That's going to prevent us from cutting the lips of our new seals. So we're going to start with the dust seal, and this spring side is going to be facing the bottom of the fork. I'm going to put some grease on here on the inside of that seal. So I'm going to work that on, and before I slide it down, I'm going to put a little fork oil on this tube as well. Then next we have this retaining ring, but this style we're actually going to wait to put this on until we have the seals driven on. After that, we've got the oil seal. Now it's really important, this open side needs to be facing up towards the top of the fork, and the closed side will be facing down. If you have any questions about that, you can refer to the one you took off and the orientation of that, how you took it off. And then you'll also notice the side with the double lip will be facing up. Slide that on. Then we're going to remove the seal bullet. Sometimes these can be kind of tight, so you just rock it back and forth. We've got our backup ring. Slide that down on there. And then from here we're going to be using fork oil. So we're going to lube up both of the bushings. So this is the bushing for that outer tube. Slide that down. Bushing for the inner tube. And you can use your thumb to spread that if you need to. Make sure that clicks into place. And then from here, we can slide this outer tube into place. With this tube on, we're going to drive the seal into place. Now there's two tricks to that. So number one, I'm going to set this bushing first. We're just going to use the seal driver to do that. So that's on there. To help the seal go in easier, I'm actually going to heat this outer tube up again. And if you don't want to use the torch, you can use your heat gun. Just make sure you don't heat up that seal very much. And we'll take our driver, and with this heated up, a lot of times you can just press it right in all the way down, but typically what you'll want to do is drive that seal in until you hear the pitch change. So hopefully you guys could hear that bottom out. So that one's good. If you have troubles driving it in with it still in the vise, you can put the tube upside down on top of the table, and it makes it a little easier to drive in, but I don't like that style just because that lower tube is going to be moving around on you. So from here, we need to take this retaining clip, and we're just going to spread it over the tube. Just be sure you don't scratch this tube when you spread that and put it on. And then what we need to do, there's a groove inside here. We need to make sure this sits in the groove. So once you've made sure that groove is fully exposed, I'm just going to squeeze the open end of that retaining ring together, and we're going to install that first and then just press this down into place. You can actually use 1/2 of this driver just to make sure that's all the way in its groove. But even if you do that, you want to visually look at it, make sure it's all the way down in there. And then from here, we're just going to push straight down, and that dust seal, it's going to bottom out on our axle holder. and we can just push this outer tube right onto it. So we're looking good there. I'm going to take a rag, wipe up any excess grease, and at this point we can start bleeding the fork up. Now real quick, before we fill this up with oil, we need to install the spring seat. So these are going to look a little different from year to year. So anything that came out of there when you're draining this out, make sure it gets back in the same way. So, and you know, for ours, this bigger side of the cone is going to be facing up. So with the axle holder in the vise, I'm going to pull up on the damping rod. We're going to install this push rod. From here, we're going to fill the fork up with 5-weight fork oil. And then we're going to bleed all the air out of it. So we just have this Motion Pro tool that actually screws on to the end of that damping rod. That'll go on a few threads. And then we're just going to pump this up and down until we don't feel any more bubbles in it. If you have a nice, smooth, consistent damping action, that's how you know you have all the air bled out of the system. So we're going to do this at least 10 times, maybe more. And if the fluid gets low, make sure you top it off. So our damping rod's feeling pretty good. So from here, before we set the oil level, we're going to let that oil sit for about 10 minutes, let any bubbles rise to the top. So in the meantime, I'm going to reinstall our O-ring. Some models, again, they're not going to have this O-ring. Slide this down, then we'll install that spring guide. With the spring guide, make sure that you have this threaded all the way down. So that bottomed out right there. That's exactly what you want. It's turning this shaft with it. So we'll just let that sit for a couple more minutes. So we let that oil sit. Now we have the fork oil level gauge. I set this at 105 millimeters. So what we're doing here with this outer tube sitting all the way down on that axle holder, we're going to measure from the top, and your range is anywhere from 95 millimeters all the way to 115 millimeters. But again, we're going right in the middle to 105 millimeters. So you can just tune the suspension with that. So the more oil height, the more bottoming resistance you're going to have. But if you leave more airspace in the top, you're going to have less bottoming resistance. So it kind of depends on what feel you're going for. But again, we're going right in the middle. So we're just going to pull on this syringe until we just hear bubbles coming up. So we're maxed out on that. We're probably going to have to pull one more time. So now we're just sucking air. We know we're at 105 millimeters. So once you have the oil height set, the easiest way for me to get everything back on is to use this Motion Pro tool again. So I'm going to pull the damping rod all the way up, and then we can slide that spring on. And then I can hold on the Motion Pro tool and hold this damping rod up. And then from here, makes it easy just to get that wrench on there. So I'm going to remove the tool. Now we're going to install the fork cap. So just remember, we have this washer on the bottom. Then we have this cup with the open side facing up. So we'll set that into place. And then the main thing to keep in mind here, when you install this fork cap, you want to spin this on until this bottoms out on this shaft. And then once you feel this bottom out, then you can tighten up that spring guide and then tighten those together. I'm actually going to move this wrench out of the way for now. So I can feel that bottom out. Now it's turning the whole damping rod assembly. There should be a gap between the spring guide and the cap. You should be able to see some threads in there, you know, with it fully bottomed out. If you don't see that, go in there and check your work and find out what happened. Maybe the spring guide wasn't all the way on or something. But from here we can just back that up and tighten these down. We don't have a torque spec for you, but you just want to get them to where they sit against each other and then get them tight. So once that's tight, you can go ahead and thread the cap onto that outer tube. Make sure you got a little lube on that O-ring right there. And then to tighten this, I'm just going to put it in the vise. But if you don't have something with soft jaws, you can use your triple clamps. And with the fork cap, when you tighten this down, you're not going to crank on it. If you do, you're never going to get it back off. So we just seated right there. We're going to just slightly snug it up. Then from here, you just need to reset your clickers. So on the 2012 to 2018 models, again, both forks are the same. Go through and do the same steps for the other side. And with that being said, I'm going to grab our other fork and we're going to show you the differences on that. So we have the right fork right here. This does our compression and our preload adjustments. Now with the separate function forks, you don't actually have to do anything with these adjusters. So I'm just going to loosen this cap up. And you can hear these forks should have been bled at some point. And then from there, we're going to bust that cap off. So we've got that cap off. You can see it's a little bit different. We don't have that, that collar on there. So I'm going to go ahead and get this other fork seal replaced, and then we'll get this fork back together. Last thing we're going to do is wipe this down and then get these reinstalled onto our bike. Now I just want to remind you guys, since this or both of these forks had a ton of pressure buildup in them, make sure you bleed these out. You know, when you do that, you want your bike on the center stand, back off that bleeder screw, let the pressures even out, and then reinstall the bleed screw. And that's all there is to replacing the fork seals on the Sachs 48mm open cartridge forks. If you need these fork seals or any of the special tools that we use today, check out our website. We also have a lot of different parts on there for the betas. Now, if you want to see more helpful content like this, subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.